Well, what a treat that's all been this evening. Quite extraordinary. Just so many beautiful pieces of music, songs, and this wonderful painting to reflect on. It's a conference that's turning out to give so many riches already, and it's just an absolute pleasure to be here again with you. And I was asked, really, to reflect a little bit on the subject of storytelling in Luke, and to look at this through the means of visual art. So that's what we're going to do today. As you know, I'm an art historian, and I find endless riches within visual works of art. And through just a few moments, a few encounters in the Gospel of Luke, I've selected some works for us to look at and to explore from a range of different perspectives, and hopefully all will become clear as we proceed. But I thought we might as well begin with an image of the man himself, Luke the evangelist. You can see he's on the title page there, and that comes from an annunciation. Bishop Philip talked to us about this extraordinary moment of this angelic messenger arriving for this extraordinary message to Mary. And of course, the Annunciation is a much beloved subject in the history of art. And here we have a work from the Italian Renaissance, from the Umbrian school, a very elaborate work that seeks to emphasize Mary's dignity, beauty, royalty, high status. You can see all of that in that very glamorous Italian, beautiful setting here. And there we have the angel Gabriel on the left, Mary on the right, the presence of God indicated by the shimmering gold above. There's a lot going on here, but what I really love about this particular Annunciation is that figure between them. Let's zoom in a little bit. It's a representation of the evangelist Saint Luke between Gabriel and Mary, and what is he doing? He's taking notes. He's writing the gospel. He's mediating between God and humanity, between the figures. He's like a reporter, in a sense. And I just love the way that this 15th century painter has chosen to represent Luke, who looks serene but quite concentrated in the act of writing, and as if to emphasize the enormity of what he's writing. It's not just a piece of paper. He's writing on a huge kind of banderole. It's like a scroll, but it's a strip that's often used to designate speech, actually, spoken word in art of this period. There are books everywhere. Of course, we have the traditional book that Mary holds. Luke has a book on his lap. And, wonderfully, his attribute, the winged ox next to him, who identifies Luke as Luke for us, as well as, of course, the Annunciation setting. Even the ox is entangled in the words, the sort of fabric of the gospel there. And there's even a book nestled in between the ox's front legs. And I love just small details, really interesting things about borders and touch in these kinds of paintings. If you look at the wing nearest me of the ox, can you see that it comes infinitesimally close to Gabriel, but it does not touch? Look at the other end. Can you see a swishing tail there? The ox's tail swishes, but infinitesimally close to the Virgin, but it does not touch. And touch, proximity, and borders are going to be a few little themes that will perhaps come out in what we explore this evening. This kind of Annunciation is fairly traditional in many ways. But what about when artists in our own age use their imaginations to rethink a familiar image? We might look at the work of the extraordinary Portuguese artist Rego, who sadly died just a few years ago. She was Portuguese, but she spent a lot of her career working in London and had a very close connection with the National Gallery in London, a residency there that was very fruitful. She's an absolutely remarkable figure in the art world for many reasons, but a couple of them being her extraordinary imagination, her casting of figures in sort of living tableaus who work out dramas often riven with tensions and ambivalences, but also her technical skill, specifically in the medium of chalk pastel. And I don't know if anyone here has ever tried making a work of art using chalk pastel. I have, and it's one of the trickiest media to use and to do well. This is an Annunciation by Paula Rego. What do we see here? It's very different, isn't it? Look at Mary. What does she look like? A schoolgirl, perhaps. She's wearing blue, which is the traditional colour for Mary, signifying her high status, but it's the pleated skirt of perhaps a uniform. She has an awkward adolescent quality to her. Maybe she looks even slightly stroppy. And Gabriel, have you ever seen a Gabriel like that? Has arrived, a stocky, Hispanic-looking figure of an indeterminate gender, perhaps. Wings that we actually know from Paula Rego's discussion of this work are strapped on. The artist used a model with strapped-on wings and then chose to retain the strap, if you can see that there. And the figure announces what will be with Mary, with this extraordinary gesture to the womb. Can you see that? It's bodily. That work is part of a cycle that was commissioned for the chapel in the Presidential Palace in Lisbon, the Belém Chapel. You can see the cycle here. And what Paula Rego was asked to produce was a kind of Stations of Mary. The full title is The Cycle of Life of the Virgin Mary and the Passion of Christ. And the artist explained that her concern here was to rethink the familiar story from the perspective of Mary. She did it in, I think, a consciously reverent and at the same time subversive way. We don't have time to look at the full cycle, although they're worth looking at. You can see them arranged there around the chapel, interestingly in juxtaposition with a traditional work of art on the far wall, a traditional nativity above the altar. But I just want to bring our attention to this from the cycle. This is Rego's Nativity. Let's think about how many images of the Nativity we've seen, how we are surrounded, we are saturated, our culture is saturated with the imagery of the Nativity. Advent calendars, Christmas cards, before you've even stepped into a gallery. How often have you seen the Nativity? And she gave birth to her firstborn son and wrapped him in bands of cloth and laid him in a manger. What do we see? Usually, she wrapped him in bands of cloth and laid him in a manger. The baby is presented to us in the manger. Do we ever see, and she gave birth to her firstborn son? And here we have an image of a body in labor, a body that has borne the Son of God within it. And that Son of God must be incarnate, must enter the world. It's a birth. It's something that approximately half the population frequently go through. It's very ordinary. And yet it's extraordinary here as well. And Gabriel, look at the angel. Gabriel has adopted the role of a kind of midwife to the birth. God's messenger present, cradling Mary as she labors, as she goes through the pain of childbirth, the duration of it, the sweat, the blood, the agony of this bringing to life of the Son of God, of Emmanuel. And I really notice about this work, many things. The light is very significant, that strong light coming from the left, casting these bright shadows, stark shadows. I notice the gesture of Mary's hand on her belly that echoes that gesture that we saw before on the belly of the angel. It's like a kind of transference of that. There are all kinds of things, but that kind of supporting of the body is very striking as well. So she wrapped him in bands of cloth and laid him in the manger, because there was no place for them in the inn. Let's look at another work. This one. What do we see here? It's a snow scene, a snowy village sometime in the past. It's European, it's in the Netherlands. It's a busy scene in a large village or a small town. People are rushing around, concerned with carrying things, fetching things, going out, coming home, interacting, collecting firewood, collecting water. There's a foolish, somewhat foolhardy little child on the ice in the foreground who is scudding backwards towards a hole in the ice. There's all kinds of little human dramas going on here. It's a busy scene, and it is this, the adoration of the kings in the snow, also known as the Epiphany, by Peter Bruegel the Elder, painted in 1563. I don't like being asked the question that I get asked a lot, which is, what is my favorite artwork? Or if I could, have a desert island disc artwork, what would it be? Because I can't answer that question. But if I really have to, sometimes, quite often, I say this one. I think it's an extraordinary painting for many reasons, some of which I'd just like to share with you. We should note, of course, that Luke's gospel talks about the shepherds, not the kings, but will allow this image here as well. But can you find the Holy Family? Can you find the focus of this painting? Have you seen them yet? They are at the very farthest margin they could possibly be at in this painting. So we're back with that kind of like sort of infinitesimal edge, an edge to something. The artist has taken the decision not only to place the Christ child and the Holy Family right at the edge of this painting, but also to make it a snow scene. What does snow do? Snow hides, it covers, we could say it swaddles, it obscures. It also changes how things look. Can you see how the roofs are highlighted, for example? See how the heads of people there are dusted in snow. But the artist has also almost effaced his own artwork. Can you imagine painting this detailed scene and then taking your white pigment and scattering it, dotting it all over the surface? So there's something fascinating going on here about hiding, what is obscured. And I think this is so conscious and so delicate here and echoed in that placement of the Holy Family right there at the far left. And if we zoom in a little bit, we can see the crowds milling around. We gradually discern that some of them are heading towards that family. There are figures bowing, kneeling. There's a sense of visitors coming, but they are only part of the world, the wider scene. And right at the edge, an image, I think, of absolute humility, of ordinariness, barely there, and yet absolutely part of this scene. This is a very close-up image of the kind that it's very difficult to get with the naked eye, but the wonders of technology can bring it to us, where you can just see that Jesus, the baby, is almost immaterial there, just sketched by the artist. And I think, therefore, this painting has something quite fundamentally to do with recognition, with seeing, with perception, and with what happens on the edges and the margins. It has to do with a kind of diminishment, in a way, as well as the most extraordinary event in the history of humanity and of the world. Let's think about something that the Catholic activist, worker, and theologian Dorothy Day wrote in 1945 in an essay called Room for Christ. I like this very much, and I like thinking about it in conjunction with this painting. She wrote, "If everyone were holy and handsome, with altar Christus shining in neon lighting from them, it would be easy to see Christ in everyone. If Mary had appeared in Bethlehem, clothed, as St. John says, with the sun, a crown of 12 stars on her head and the moon under her feet, then people would have fought to make room for her. But that was not God's way for her, nor is it Christ's way for himself now, when he is disguised under every type of humanity that treads the earth." And I think it's from this perspective that we can read this remarkable painting and think of how Christ is veiled in flesh as this slice of ordinary life, and our world is veiled in snow. So far, we've been thinking about seeing the unseen, things that we don't usually see. Something about God at the margins, at the edges, these thin borders between or within our encounters with God. Let's come on to think a little bit about touch. In a moment, I'm going to get Matt up to read a passage for us. Just before I do, this is the oldest work of art I've brought to show to you. It's prehistoric. I don't know if any of you have seen this before or images of it. It's known as the Cave of Hands. I thought about this because of this little segment where we're going to think about the sense of touch. We've been talking a lot about sight, but what about touch? And just look at this record of centuries, even millennia, of human beings who have desired to touch and to leave a record of that touch on this cave wall. There are layers and layers and layers of handprints made by people as far back as 7,300 BC, it is estimated. I think it's a wonderfully kind of human image. It's playful, it's creative, it's very real, it's very tangible, and there are many more of these hand paintings. They suggest also something of a kind of crowding of humanity as well. And these are all relevant, I think, as a way into thinking about the passage I'd like to ask Matt to read for us. It's from the 8th chapter of Luke.
And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years, but nobody could heal her. She came up behind him and touched the edge of his cloak, and immediately the bleeding stopped. "Who touched me?" Jesus asked. When they all denied it, Peter said, Master, the people are crowding and pressing against you. Huh? But Jesus said, someone touched me. I know that power has gone out from me. Then the woman, seeing that she could not go unnoticed, came trembling and fell at his feet. In the presence of all the people, she told why she had touched him and how she had been instantly healed. Then he said to her, Daughter, your faith has healed you. Now go in peace.
Thank you. I put some images up as Matt was reading that so beautifully. And I wanted us to think about this act of touch in faith, and again about bodies, her trembling, her falling to the ground, rendered in this beautiful little sketch by Rembrandt. Remember the touch of the crowds. I was also interested when I was thinking about this passage. I just decided to look at a few different translations, and I was just very struck by the King James Version, how it renders this line, and Jesus said, somebody hath touched me, for I perceive that virtue is gone out of me. Most other translations read power. I'm not an expert in the King James Bible era and the use of language then, but there's something striking here about the idea of virtue leaving the body somehow in this old translation. And it reminds us, of course, we know that this woman who lived with this hemorrhaging, this bleeding for 12 years, was ritually unclean, impure, according to ritual custom and practices of that era. It meant that she was isolated. It meant that just mixing with others, touching, particularly touching a man, touching Jesus, contravened all the purity laws. When I was thinking about this passage, which I really wanted to look at with you, I initially had a complex work of conceptual art to look at, and then I just found myself honing in more and more just on this woman. And somehow, the most appropriate work that came to my mind was the work, actually in a broad sense, of Ana Mendieta, an extraordinary Cuban, Afro-Cuban artist who had a short life. Her life ended tragically at quite a young age. She died suddenly at a young age. But before she did, she was exiled from Cuba. She was taken as a 12-year-old away from her family as a refugee, effectively, and settled in Iowa, where she experienced great difficulty encountering this, to her, strange culture. And then as an artist, she returned often to Latin America, to Central America, and Mexico in particular, and rediscovered a connection with that culture. And she made many extraordinary works, films, sculptures, photographs, and so on, often using herself. And in this extraordinary piece, she occupies disused niches in an old monastery that she visited in Mexico. And you can see her body is shrouded here in a white cloth. It's a little bit like a living sculpture, but the body, it's both mobile and immobile. It's both seen and unseen, known and not known. There's an anonymity to it. She's straining at that cloth, the binding that holds her and constrains her. And it made me think about these dynamics of touch, of ideas of purity, symbolized by this unstained, flawless cloth here. Think about, really, not to put too fine a point on it, the staining that is part of the everyday life of a woman with uncontrollable incessant bleeding and what that means. Anna Mendieta herself worked extensively with blood in her artistic practice, often in contact with her own body. This is a still from a performance called Body Tracks, where she drags her hands down a surface that is smeared with either red pigment or blood. She used paint and blood, animal blood, interchangeably in some of these works. They're very suggestive of ritual practices, which is something she was very interested in from her Cuban heritage. But there's something also that reminds me of this woman, her desperation, her focus, her determination, her reaching out, and that kind of breaking down of a barrier that happens at that moment of touch, the breaking of a taboo that is, in the end, the liberation of her as she falls and comes trembling and falling down before Jesus, as Jesus realizes this woman's faith and her healing. And it makes me think of other works by Anna Mendieta, and finally, as a kind of defiant staining, if you like, and films she made. I like this image as she walks away, upright, away from that trace of her touch. I'm keeping an eye on the time and taking us to think a little bit about resonance, listening. We're still a little bit with the senses. We've looked at touch and moving on to listening. But I like the word resonance more. I wanted to show you this painting, a Spanish painting from the so-called Golden Age, of a kitchen maid pausing at her work. She's in a shadowy interior. She's at her place of labor. She's surrounded by domestic vessels that she's perhaps been using to prepare a meal, or maybe she's about to prepare a meal. There's a pestle and mortar. There's a garlic bulb. There's a cloth in front of her, various vessels. But we can see from her attitude that she pauses, and you will have noticed, again, at the margins, at the edge, at the hem of the painting, if you like. Just there is a scene that we can make out through a kind of opening, like a window or an aperture. And indeed, this is Diego Velázquez's Kitchen Maid with the Supper at Emmaus. Let's just remind ourselves, when he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. Look at that, and how that passage is so much about seeing, recognizing, the moment of recognition in the gesture. The eyes are opened. There's recognition, there's vanishing. There's a lot around the optics. And what about this woman that Velázquez imagines in 17th century Seville, where he was working? A kitchen maid, a lowly person, domestic worker, who senses something too, without looking, and I think that is crucial. She doesn't look, but something resonates for her. Briefly, I want to show you something interesting, which is that until 1933, the painting looked like this. This is an old black and white photograph of it. Can you see that something's missing? At some point between when Velázquez painted the Kitchen Maid with the Supper at Emmaus, somebody owned it and decided simply to obliterate the part of the painting that, for whatever reason, they didn't want there. It seems extraordinary to us, but the art historical explanation for this is that the genre, the type of painting of a kitchen scene, was the most fashionable at that time. And probably an owner at some point wanted a Velázquez kitchen scene. These scenes were known as a bodegon, a kitchen or a taverna scene, where the viewer of the painting could admire the vessels. The objects owned by a domestic household. And we can extrapolate to the kitchen maid belongs, in that view, in that 17th century view, to the objects that belong to the household. And for whatever reason, the supper at Emmaus was obliterated, obscured, but of course it was there all the time, and diligent restorers at the National Gallery of Ireland found that it was there and revealed it again. So the painting is restored back to its present state. But I've hinted at a sense of this woman being owned. The painting has been known for centuries and in many different contexts by a different title, Mulatta, La Mulatta. I talked about this painting to another group at one point. There was a priest in the audience who is from Spain, and he said, oh yes, the painting is still known by that title there. And it refers to the woman, who is a woman of mixed race. The term mulatta, as you might know, derives from the idea of the mule, the mix of a horse and donkey as beasts of labor mixed together to make a strong laboring body. And we should remember in looking at this painting that when it was painted in Seville in the 17th century, the population of the city was 120,000, and it is estimated that 30,000 of that population were enslaved in one way or another. If we bear this in mind, it becomes entirely plausible that this is the situation of this woman as well, who Velázquez places at the center of this scene. She is the one who perceives without seeing. And I love that dramatic reimagining of this scene from the perspective of this woman whose exact circumstances we can't know, but we can conjecture, and we can conjecture how she would have been seen by viewers at the time who would have seen her as the lowliest of status. And she is the central agent of this image. Rather brilliantly, do you remember that time in the pandemic when there was a bit of a craze for restaging great works of art? Do you remember people doing all sorts of things with loo rolls and whatever, and restaging old masters' paintings and so on? Well, as part of that phenomenon, a well-known, wonderful opera singer, Peter Braithwaite, who's a London-based British opera singer, started making a series of these kinds of works as well, focusing on black figures in works of art. And he made a series called Rediscovering Black Portraiture in this guise. And there he is, that's Peter Braithwaite, in his kitchen in London, restaging Velázquez's Kitchen Maid, rather brilliantly, as you can see. It's such a clever image for lots of reasons, but the thing that I love about it the most is, can you see what's up in the top left-hand corner of Peter Braithwaite's image? It's not the Supper at Emmaus, but it is a score of Bach's St. John's Passion. And so think about it, it's just brilliant. For this singer, this man who is immersed in singing, in music, what for him resonates? The presence of God. He's activating that sense of hearing. And he's playing, I think, with the fact that, of course, you don't hear a score of music, but there's a kind of sensory relationship there that's witty and brilliant, I think. And it's a lovely detail that Braithwaite himself has sung the role of Christ in Bach's St. John's Passion. So there's a relationship there, too. I came across something in a book that I picked up, actually, in the somewhere on Iona, and this writer said something that stayed with me. Sometimes I think that faith is only about increasing peripheral vision, peripheral hearing. I think that's as good a definition for at least one aspect of faith as any other that I know. And, you know, we can think about all these borders and so on that we've been looking at. I can see I'm slightly running out of time, so I'm going to briefly touch on, well, an episode from Acts. I once asked a family if I could basically borrow their 7-year-old daughter. There's a lovely Christian family, and I asked the lovely Christian parents to read to the daughter a particular Bible passage and then get her to do a rendering of it. And this is Abigail, aged 7's, brilliant rendition of Paul on the road to Damascus. Let's just stop and take a look at this for a moment. How brilliant, how economically brilliant this is. So, we have a man who looks pretty displeased, downturned mouth, eyes are slits. You see, the eyes are closed, but there's a lot going on above in the sky, which is radiant. There are angels, they look really happy, big upturned smiles there, and a central figure who's definitely saying something, mouth wide open. A great details here. Look at the way that the posture of the unhappy man below mimics the posture of the speaking man above. I can tell you've worked it out, obviously, already. I forewarned Matt that we might not have time for all the readings. He would have read, obviously, the story of Paul on the road to Damascus there. But we remember that suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. We have Caravaggio's painting, Paul fallen back. The light is stood in for by the piebald horse, and that leg threateningly raised, which is almost like a zigzag of lightning. Do you see it? And the vulnerability of that figure who crashes back to the floor in a posture of complete submission, vulnerability, some fleshy parts of his body exposed to the threat of that horse's hoof that could come down in a stamp at any moment. Bruegel tackled the subject as well, hiding Paul away as a tiny detail in a landscape. I'm getting towards the end. We started slightly late, so I'll just go on just a couple of minutes. And I've brought us back to Bruegel because he has this habit of hiding these little details in these images of the world. The famous Hunters in the Snow, secular painting, snowy landscape. Can you see on the ice in the distance that somebody's taken a fall? There, almost unseen, a fallen figure. Behind, a house is on fire. I find it poignant that Bruegel puts Paul's fall from the horse into a melee of his own, surrounded by all of that life going on. There's a bringing down and an embedding in humanity. In the church that I attend, which is St. Mary's Scottish Episcopal Cathedral in Glasgow, we have these windows. One shows Paul at that moment of hearing the voice of the Lord. I love in this Victorian window, I don't know who it's designed by, but I just love that I walk past it and I see Paul dropping his sword and then brilliantly being led away by the hand, as the scripture tells us, with his head hung low, of course, to meet Ananias and the restoration of sight as something like scales fell from his eyes. My concluding passage is to show you some works by Andreas Gursky, who is interested in our contemporary world. This 99-cent photograph. Look at this as an image of our contemporary life. Or his photograph titled Amazon, which came after he made a series of photographs of great rivers. He made these in the 90s. And then in 2016, the Rhine has become the Amazon. I'm compelled and horrified by Gursky's work all at the same time. He photographs these mega signs, as he calls them. This one was one I stood in front of at the Biennale in Venice a few years ago, and it shows workers at a wicker factory in Vietnam, women who are working to produce wicker objects to be sold in the West, cheaply all over the place. I stood there, I thought about hands going back, layer upon layer, multitudes of unnamed people. As I stood there, I moved closer, and suddenly I saw a woman looking out, looking at me. I noticed her. Just a little fragment like this. There she is, reminding me of another woman in a crowd, lost in a crowd, unseen, unnoticed, until she did something. Makes me think of this too. And I want to end by reading Thomas Merton, who's a writer I love very much, and this is one of the most extraordinary things I think he ever wrote. In 1966, Merton, the Trappist contemplative monk and activist, "We live in the time of no room, which is the time of the end, the time when everyone is obsessed with lack of time, lack of space, with saving time, conquering space, projecting into time and space the anguish produced within them by the technological furies of size, volume, quantity, speed, number, price, power, and acceleration. Into this world, this demented inn, in which there is absolutely no room for him at all, Christ has come, uninvited." Thank you.